Hey everyone, just want to do a quick video here on some notes. This is in your orange packet on the top where it says the Cold War at Home. This would have been our next section after we talked about Cuban Missile Crisis and Bay of Pigs and kind of talked about some of the early actions of the Cold War in Korea and space race, Berlin Wall. We would have switched gears and really looked at what was happening here in the United States during the Cold War. So a couple of things were happening, and this is actually one of my really favorite units to teach, and I'm super bummed that we won't be able to do this together because it's some really cool activities that I thought were just fun, super fun things to do. But so you're just following along, filling in the answers as you go. Feel free to pause this if you feel like you need to or that you want to stop and write. If you are, maybe you've had global or this is something that's super familiar to you and you feel like you can fast forward, be my guest to do that as well. In the back of the packet, you'll see that there's the chapter from our textbook, the reading that this came from. So you can always refer to that as well. So some of the, or a lot of what happened during the early part of the Cold War here in the U.S. came from the fear of communism, often referred to as the Red Scare. We talked about kind of a Red Scare, well, not kind of, we did talk about a Red Scare that happened in the United States after World War I. The idea that a lot of Americans were afraid communism was going to come here. So because of the Red Scare that was happening after World War II, President Truman created something called the Loyalty Review Board. A lot of anti-communists gave Truman a lot of criticism, thinking he was soft on communism. So to combat that, Truman said, all right, fine, here's an executive order. We're going to put together a loyalty review board. Basically, we're going to investigate anyone in the government who may be disloyal to the U.S. So they looked at 91 different organizations and looking for any communist subversion. Basically, anyone who was associated with communism, sympathized with communists, and that was ground for suspension or firing of their job. Between 1947 and 1951, it will investigate 3.2 million people and dismiss 212 as a security risk. A lot, nearly 3,000 people are going to resign because they don't want to feel investigated or they don't want to be investigated. They feel like this violates their civil rights. And really, the really shady part about it, if you were under investigation, you couldn't see the evidence against you. So you might think like, well, why do you suspect I'm a communist? But you weren't allowed to be privy to that evidence. As time went, the House of Representatives put together the House Un-American Activities Committee, often referred to as HUAC, and they began investigating communism in the movie industry. The reason was there were a lot of pro-Russian films made during World War II when Russia was a U.S. ally. Well, after World War II, Russia turns to communism, and the House of Representatives thought the movie industry was sneaking in communist propaganda into films. So they really are starting to take a closer look at the movie industry. They call all of these witnesses from Hollywood. Most of them were friendly. Most of them support the investigation. Most of them go along with it. 10 of them, though, said, listen, we're not going to testify. We're not going to be a part of this. They were deemed unfriendly and referred to as the Hollywood 10. They refuse to answer questions. They're sent to prison. And quickly, Hollywood starts to blacklist people. People were condemned for having communist background, meant their careers were ruined. They would never work again. Think about it. If somebody's accused of something, whether they're ever convicted of it or not, they're simply just accused. A lot of times that will associate with them, that will be attached to them for a really long time, if not possibly for the rest of their life. And so that's exactly what's happening here. People are associated with communism. Nobody else wanted anything to do with it. And here you see some pictures of those hearings and of the Hollywood 10. This is going to lead to the McCarran Security Act. Basically, this is going to make it unlawful for anyone to plan the establishment of a dictator in the U.S. That may seem silly to us today, like who's going to actually, overthrow the government, but it was a real fear at the time. Truman, Remember, he's accused of being soft on communism, but he says, we can't do this. Like, we can't violate people's rights. It's a free country. We can't just, kick them out or arrest them for their opinion. However, Congress used their override power and overrode Truman's veto and put the McCarran Act into law. There were several spy cases that took place during the 1950s and the 1960s. One of them is, even before the 1950s, I should have said, Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was a communist, or was associated with a communist spy, a man named Whittaker Chambers, who said, listen, I'm a communist spy, but so is Alger Hiss. He spied for the Soviet Union. And Whittaker Chambers comes forward with evidence, photos, documents. They say, listen, these were typed on Alger Hiss's typewriter. I can prove it. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had come across, or had passed, meaning too much time had passed for Alger Hiss to be convicted. Instead, he was convicted of perjury. Always claimed his innocence to the day he died. In the 1990s, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were thawing out of the Cold War, the Soviets then in the 1990s, with transferring to the Russians, released some information that did seem to prove that Alger Hiss was most likely a communist spy. Here are pictures of Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers. Then one of the more famous cases during this time is that of the Rosenbergs. So the Rosenbergs, you see here, Julius and Ethel, were accused of giving secrets to the Soviet Union about America's atomic bomb. So in September of 1949, the U.S. learns that the Soviets have tested an atomic bomb. People are wondering, how did they get this information? Someone in the U.S. had to have taught them how to do it. There's no way they could have figured it out. A German-born scientist, Klaus Fuchs, admits, yep, you know what, I gave them information. He was privy to it with his job. He says, however, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg helped me. The Rosenbergs were a part of the American Communist Party, albeit they were minor members. They were still a part of the party. They deny the charges. They plead the fifth. Everyone says, well, they got to be guilty. They're pleading the fifth. They're found guilty, sentenced to death. They'll be the first U.S. civilians sentenced to death for espionage. There was a lot of sympathism around the Rosenbergs. A lot of people pleaded for them to not be executed. They had 2 young sons. However, a lot of people figure they were just because they were immigrants and associated with the Communist Party. But that is not how the government felt, and they were executed. One of my favorite things to teach is McCarthyism. In this unit, I always kind of come into class on one particular day and I get really stern looking, and I pretty much say somebody has cheated on a recent quiz, which, we take quizzes through this unit, and so that's, within the possibility of something could have happened. And I get really stern looking and I get really angry, and I have a clipboard and I say, I've got names on this clipboard of people who have cheated, and I've already talked to the principals, and if you don't admit to it right here and right now, I will give everyone in this class a 0. And I usually play it off pretty well. Sometimes I have to stifle a laugh here or there because I know it's a prank. Basically, my goal is to get you to feel the way people felt during the era of McCarthyism. So this is Senator McCarthy. And basically, during this time period, he gives a speech and he says, hey, listen, the State Department is infested with communists. And that word infested just sounds, dangerous and gross almost even. And he takes this sheet of paper and he waves it in the speech and he says there needs to be a special investigation on who in the State Department is communist. So the Senate gets together, they start looking at this, and they're like, there's really nothing to go on here. This is kind of groundless, meaning there's nothing to go off of. McCarthy says, nope, there's communists. I know there's communists. We have to have hearings, and he does. He holds these confrontational hearings, and he says, listen, people need to fess up, or we're going to find out who you are. He doesn't have any proof. Like if you had asked in my little activity, hey, can I see that list? I usually play it off and go, no, you can't see the list. You can't see the list of cheaters. You know who you are. Step up and do it. And no one has ever, in my 13 years of teaching American history, pushed me on that. Because that's just human nature. And that's the same thing. No one really pushes McCarthy at first, but he's going around and he's basically insinuating that these people are communists and really ruining people's reputations. He had fought for a smaller federal government. He wanted control on labor unions. He was doing this as a political ploy. He needed an issue. Communism was going to be his issue. And so he's going to really put this fear out there. The people are accused of being communist. And this word McCarthyism now. When you're fearful that you're going to be associated with something, that's where this term now has come from. And not all of these are on your notes right here, by the way. I know if you're following along, don't worry. Some of these things aren't necessarily there. And this is a picture of him saying, this is a quote, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless were still working and shaping policy in the State Department." This really, really scared people, these claims. Okay, well, as the time goes, there's not a lot of findings. There's not a lot of credibility to McCarthy's arguments. There's also, we're in the middle of the Korean War. We've got Alger Hiss. We've got the Rosenbergs. There's a lot going on at the same time. It's not just McCarthyism. He doesn't drop it. He keeps going. He starts a Senate subcommittee, tries to investigate communists, continues making attacks on people. The public starts to believe him. The public start to think, man, this guy must really actually have something. Who in the government is working for the Soviet Union? Who in the government is working as a communist? Part of the Hollywood 10 that I already mentioned. Part of people being blacklisted. Same deal here. Okay. So McCarthy was falsely accusing people, giving innuendos, falsifying evidence, doctoring photographs, basically bullying people, trying to get people to admit to being communists. Really playing up on that fear of people's communism. You can see here the victims of McCarthyism, people who were either blacklisted, quit their jobs, people who were fired. This really, really messed up some people's lives. People all really started questioning, wait a second. After time, they really started thinking, do you really think that many people are communist in this country? And so he really started making people question that. The hearings were televised. People weren't liking kind of how McCarthy was bullying people. So this starts to really kind of slow down. People start questioning it. He even challenges President Eisenhower. And people are like, hang on a second. Come on, McCarthy. Maybe you've gone a little too far. He attacks the U.S. Army, questioning loyalty within the Army. You can see here, look at this guy's face right here. Totally unimpressed of the things that he is saying. He's at this for 4 years now. The Army comes out and just proves that he's lying. They're like, these are cropped, these are doctored. This guy's kind of a little bit crazy. They realize that he had faked letters, and he's eventually, he even admitted later on that the list of names was something he had just pulled from his briefcase. He's censured, meaning he basically has to stop. He dies in office for basically of alcoholism. He gets hepatitis after he goes on kind of an several years of alcoholism. All right. So that's McCarthy. These are some reflections here. You're welcome to pause and read here if you'd like. But, kind of his rise and his fall in a short period of time. But a lot of people were afraid. A lot of people came out of fear and believed him. This really impacted society, as you can see here. There was a climate of fear. TV was, Hollywood was influenced with fear. Political divisions, people losing their jobs, isolated by anyone they knew. No one wanted to be associated with someone with communism. All right, that leads me to our last 2 points here really quick. The 1950s and 60s saw people living in fear. We watched the video right before we went on this extended break. of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, but particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis. In one of the videos we watched, a woman was interviewed, are you stockpiling? And she said, no, if this thing happens and there's no reason to stockpile, we're not going to be here. So people had bomb shelters. People knew where fallout shelters were. People were stockpiling food if necessary. Kids did duck and cover drills at school where they ducked and got under their desk. If you got hit by an atomic bomb, your desk is not going to help you. But if you were, far enough away, maybe it would help keep shrapnel and things, flying debris from hurting you. As I already said, here's like a bunker that a family may have had. The fact that the Russians or the Soviets had put a satellite into space had a lot of people afraid as well. I've already mentioned duck and cover drills. Last thing here, Eisenhower is going to build the highway. I always mention this. A lot of you are starting to drive. The highway is obviously a way that people get around a lot today. We see a lot of construction in this day and age, and I think we get so angry with construction in this day and age, but you think a lot of our highways were built in the 1950s. One of the biggest reasons Eisenhower builds this is if cities need to be evacuated and if military needs to move quickly. The highway system would have allowed that to happen. So during his tenure as president, 41,000 miles are going to be created. It's going to cost a lot of money, but it's really kind of the core of our nation's infrastructure and our nation's transportation system. All right, that is it for the Cold War at Home notes. Like I said, if I was going fast, hopefully you paused. Feel free to read the chapter that's attached in the orange packet to help anything that you may need understanding. As always, ask questions if you have them.